Hi folks, welcome back to 3 Minute Tales. This is the Shebeen and I'm your storyteller, Shanna Key. Now today's story is somewhat different to what I normally cover. It's a spooky story. It's a tale that was written by a wonderful historian and Tallaght native, Albert Perez. He has an incredible blog on Facebook called A Ramble About Tallaght, and that's exactly where I found this story. Around Christmas time, and I thought I'd really like to cover that. So I hope you enjoy it. Please, if you do, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to leave a comment, you can do so down below. And as I keep saying, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, please do so. And tickle the little notification bell. That means that each time we upload, you're notified. So happy days. So yeah, thanks so much for your time. I'm Shanna Key. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve 1932, 26-year-old John Finnegan set out from his mother's house in Rathdown on a tram to the nearby town of Tallaght. He planned to stretch his legs and to take in the country air before the festivities of Christmas got underway. Arriving in Tallaght village at 2 o'clock, he intended to walk to Brittis, a 5.5 mile stretch or a 2-hour walk, and would be in plenty of time to get the 5 o'clock tram back to Roundtown. The tram was to be discontinued later that week after 40 years service, and it would be Finnegan's last chance to journey on the Dublin to Blessington tramline. As Finnegan stepped off the car, he inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the fresh country air rolling in off the Dublin Mountains. Tightening the laces of his sturdy walking boots, he set out west through the old village past O'Neill's Bar and Grocery and onwards towards Mount Seskin. The white tonsure of frost sat on the peaks of the hills around Tallaght like a pope's cap or the head of a monk. It was a gentle enough stroll, with the pathway being relatively flat, but as Finnegan took a left turn onto the sharply ascending slopes of Mount Seskin, he could feel his heart beginning to beat in his chest. As he exhaled warm and deep breaths into the cold afternoon air, he looked down over the fields of what remained of Johnville, the once stately mansion and one-time home of Mr. Nicholas Rowe of the famous Rowe whisky family, and later the setting of Dr. Luther's hydrotherapy spa before the mysterious doctor removed to Belfast. There was no better way to prepare for the Christmas celebrations in the coming days. Finnegan thought of the hearty meal that he would have the next day, and a few glasses of sherry or tawny port in the evening before parlour games. A walk in the country would build his appetite for the indulgences to follow. Traversing the crest of Mount Seskin, he could see the distant pond at Brittis, built to take water to the old Saggart paper mills. To the north he could see the tower on Uachtarard in Kildare, casting its evening shadow towards Dublin, and to the west he could see the valley of Slade and the hill of Allen. Concerned about the time, he looked at his left wrist, only to realise that he'd forgotten his watch after leaving it behind in his mother's house. The sun was still slightly above the hill of Allen, so he surmised that it was not yet 4 p.m, leaving him with about 40 minutes of daylight. The tram wasn't due for another hour yet. He saw a sign for Bohernabrina stating that it was just 1.5 miles away. He thought that it was further. If he walked briskly, he might catch a glimpse of the Great Waterworks reservoir and catch the evening bus from Bohernabrina back to Roundtown instead of taking the tram. This would just about have him home in time for tea. Approaching Ballinascorny, the light was falling fast. A dark black cloud gathered, moving like a murmuration of starlings above his head. He'd walked at least 4 miles, maybe more, but it seemed the further he walked, the more remote and further from civilization he became. The air felt damp as the late evening passed, and then the rain arrived. He walked for several hours, at a time it seemed like in circles. He thought that he could hear the waters of the River Dodder as the night became inky black. His boots now heavy with clogs as the gravel path descended to a track of clay. The last bus from Bohernabrina would be long gone. He marched on. At least it was all downhill. There was nothing else that he could do but keep going. It must have been 4, perhaps 5 hours since light had fallen. This was not how he envisaged his ramble when he had been reading his little book, The Neighbourhood of Dublin. He could hear in the distance the distant flow of the brown and yellow waters of the river. He must have crossed O'Callaghan's bridge, he thought, but he had absolutely no memory of it. It was on the banks of this river many years previous that Mrs. Kearney had watched her sons and husband hanged for conspiracy. His mind was rambling now. Whether it was the cold or sheer exhaustion, he began to shake and tremble, no longer feeling at one with nature. He had no idea where he was, but he knew he could go no further. Resting under the dead or dying canopy of an ancient oak tree, he sat on a heap of stones and listened to the sound of rain drenching the canvas of wilting leaves above his head. Soaked and down-spirited, he lay back against the trunk of the tree and lit a cigarette, a Player Wills, and then another. He cupped in his hands the small spirit lighter made from 2 coins welded together by his father during the Great War, a gift he had received for his 18th birthday. Finnegan mused that if he had got the last tramcar from British instead, he would be now home in Roundtown, sitting by the fire. He lit another cigarette and out of habit looked at his wrist, remembering again that he'd left his wristwatch at home. He'd no idea what time it was, but he knew it was late. Slumped against the tree, he resigned himself to the fact that he was lost. As the wind rustled through the leaves overhead, he noticed a horizontal ribbon of light between a cluster of bushes in the distance. It was a homestead, not 600 yards away. Suddenly filled with a renewed optimism and energy, he jumped up and, oblivious now to the rain pouring down upon him, marched in a stupor with his head down towards the light. He could no longer feel his feet, conscious only that he must put one foot in front of the other. A set of heavy wrought iron gates hung between a pair of matching pillars that were taller than a man. He could hear the crunch of the gravel beneath his feet as he approached the grand residence. He stared at the 9 sash windows and the ivy that partially covered the corners of the fine house. As he began to ascend the 9 granite steps to the residence, he stopped to kick the mucky clods off his boots against the second step. A pair of elongated narrow windows, one on each side of the door, were dressed with long red curtains and faintly illuminated by candlelight from inside. Finnegan gave the unpolished brass knocker 3 timid taps and watched his warm breath condense against the black door. He could hear a presence inside fumbling about. Thanks be to God, he thought, as he heard the shuffle of slippers on linoleum and the sliding of a bolt inside. The door slowly opened and in the half-light, Finnegan could see the figure of an elderly white-haired man. He was unshaven, tall and portly, slightly hunched as very old men can sometimes be. "Come in, man, before you catch your death," the host implored. Inside, a paraffin lamp flickered on a stand in the grand hallway and moths flapped around overhead. It was a substantial residence, though one that had seen better days. Finnegan stopped to wipe his boots on a stiff and well-worn mat. "Let me take your coat," uttered the man, before draping it on a hook beside a small silver holy water font. The man motioned with a nod towards a door down the hallway and silently ushered Finnegan into a comfortable but dimly lit parlour. 2 tall Rathborne candles gently flickered at either end of the mantelpiece as the smouldering embers of what looked like a generous turf fire. "Sit down and dry yourself off. How does a man find himself out here at this time of night?" the old man inquired. Finnegan told him his tale, how he had intended to get a tram home from British, but decided to extend his walk to Bohernabrina. "That's a good walk, all right. Another 7 miles, bedad." Finnegan realised that either the road sign was wrong or he had misread it. Either which way, he'd lost his bearings and ended up here. As the old man left the parlour to get a glass for his guest, Finnegan resisted the temptation to take hold of the poker and rake the glowing remains of the turf fire to breathe life into it again. He was grateful for the old man's hospitality and didn't want to seem overly familiar. The old man returned with a glass of boiling water and a bottle of Irish whiskey. He twisted the lid of the unopened bottle and poured a generous measure into the half-filled glass of boiling water and handed it to his guest. Finnegan watched, slightly mesmerised, as the gold and water blended into an even elixir. The steaming mixture filled the air with a homely cheer. As Finnegan put the glass to his lips, he realised that his host did not have a glass. "Are you not taking one yourself?" It is a bad guest I would be who would drink whisky alone. My days of drinking whisky, man, are long gone. I drank up my share in my own day. It's been 10 years since a drop of whisky or anything else has passed my lips. It's a bad host I would be if you didn't drink it. Finnegan stretched out his legs in front of the fire and took a sip of the whisky and felt a warm stream running down his throat and into his chest. He stared at the large ivory clock on the mantelpiece and was taken aback when he noticed the time. 6 minutes past 10. Is that clock right, can I ask? I thought it was later, asked Finnegan. And a lot later it is too, replied the old man. That clock hasn't ticked in over 30 years, not since we lost the key for it. The men spoke for some time, the host telling his guests that he had walked a great deal himself when he was younger and knew the hills well. As a young man he'd been something of a wrestler and trained in the hills of Ballinascary. He'd also been involved in public affairs, but that was long ago. After an hour or so, the men moved to retire for the night. The man handed Finnegan a tall red candle, matching his own, to light the way. Standing at the foot of the staircase, the man paused at a large portrait that hung on the wall. That is Charles Stuart Parnell, he said, and that is my father beside him. He stared at the picture wistfully, and both men studied the portrait of the two bearded figures. The old man gripped Finnegan's left wrist, causing the candle in Finnegan's hand to shed a splattering of red wax down the damp cuff of his sleeve. Look into their eyes. Great men. They took a country, a nation in hand. Leaders of men, both dead, gone forever. Finnegan could feel that the old man had never lost his wrestler's grip. Our time will come, he said. Our time will come, and we too will be gone. After a moment of silence, the man led Finnegan up the stairs and down a hallway and into a bedroom in the corner of the house. There's an extra blanket at the foot of the bed if you need it. Will I leave an extra candle? The old man asked as he shuffled towards the door. No, thank you. The one I have is all the light that I need, Finnegan replied. The room was basic, with just a bed and a small bedside table on which sat a white enamel jug. It's certainly not the Gresham Hotel, thought Finnegan. Outside, he could hear the sound of a cat wailing in the yard below, the cry of a newborn baby. Through the window he could see the silhouette of the ruins of an old tower in the moonlight. Turning away from the window, he caught a reflection of himself in the candlelight. For a moment, he thought that there was another man outside. He was tired now and climbed into bed. The white sheet was cold and damp, but it felt good to set himself down and rest. He lay his arms across his chest under the sheet to stay warm. His eyelids became heavy, and the last thing he saw was his own whisky breath rising into the damp air above him. Finnegan slept soundly till the morning and was awakened by something at the end of his bed. Opening his eyes, he found a canopy of brown leaves, mottled with blue, breaking through above him. A young countryman was standing over him, gently nudging his foot with his boot. Thanks be to God you're alive. I thought you were dead by the way you were slumped against that tree. You wouldn't be the first man to die under a tree on a night like that. Finnegan took a moment to compose himself, unsure as to exactly where he was. Have you been here all night? I'm afraid so. I think so, he replied, looking around the field surrounding him. Standing up to stretch his limbs, he began to make sense of the situation. I took shelter under the tree from the rain last night. I must have fallen asleep. Are you from the city? The countryman inquired. I am, replied Finnegan. Well, near enough. Come, I have a cart on the road. I will drop you some of the way there. I saw you lying in the field and thought you were done for. The two men walked towards the cart on the road, about 40 yards away. Finnegan climbed onto the small two-seater trap that had a black canopy overhead. The men sat in silence for a few minutes as the countryman lashed the single grey horse. A cape of frost cloaking the hills began to melt as the sun rose into the sky. It was a clear Christmas morning, with a brisk air breaking on Finnegan's cheeks. He could feel a cold and gentle breeze on his neck as the cart made its way through the village of Tallaght and onwards towards Temple Oak. The smell of turf smoke lingered on his collar. Finnegan hunched his shoulders and put his hands into his pockets to keep warm. In his right-hand pocket, he could feel what remained of his damp cigarettes and his little round lighter. In his other pocket, he felt something heavy on his wrist. Taking his hand out to look, he found on his wrist an old and unfamiliar watch, a heavy silver timepiece displaying the time, 6 minutes past 10. On the cuff of his short sleeve, just above the watch, was a splashing of dried red candle wax. That was all remained of his Christmas Eve in Tallaght and the house with the red curtains.